Hey there and welcome back to the CodeWrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll talk once again kind of about Blazor Server authentication, but we'll tackle a very specific issue, and that is how to actually get rid of all your EF Core exceptions that you might have when you try to use EntityFramework Core in Blazor Server applications, and more than that, Blazor Server applications that might also use authentication with the default Microsoft ASP.NET Core identity features, because that is a very specific scenarios where EntityFramework Core might throw a lot of exceptions if it is not used correctly. But before we get into it, I just want to say that there is on this channel already a very popular video, which is titled how to use EntityFramework Core in Blazor Server applications the right way. And I will leave in this description of this video a link to that one. And also you might see it here on a card somewhere. And if you are not familiar with the concepts of using IDbContextFactory with EntityFramework Core, then please very much go to that video first, pause this one and take a look at that, because it really doesn't make any sense to repeat a lot of things that we already described there regarding using EntityFramework Core DbContextFactory. So please go to that one and take a look at that, and then please come back here, because what we want to do right now is to actually kind of have a very specific discussion about how we should set up our project when using EntityFramework Core in a Blazor Server application where we also have authentication. And the reason why we do that and why this is a so specific topic is that when you actually have Blazor Server with authentication, you probably also have either Razor pages like we have in our project to actually perform the authentication, or you might have regular controllers that will also help you to perform authentication of a specific user and then reuse that authentication throughout your entire Blazor Server app, which is covered in depth during also other videos in this playlist that you are right now on Blazor Server authentication. Good. Now the problem arises that actually here in this kind of setup, we mix two things here. So we have on the one hand, the regular request pipeline, which we have in Razor pages or in the controllers, where we have a request, and therefore the idea of scoped services are totally or is totally exactly like it is in ASP.NET Core, regular ASP.NET Core. So for each request, you will get an instance of the scoped services that you need. But on the other side, but on the other hand, in the same application, you also have Blazor components, which are not part of the request pipeline. So scoped in that case does not actually mean that you would get an instance per request, but you get an instance actually per the entire lifetime of that Blazor circuit. And the problem here is that if you don't use EntityFramework, or if you don't set up EntityFramework right in this kind of setup, you might run into a lot of different exceptions. Probably not at the beginning stage of your application, but once you get a little bit more logic into your application, you will surely get those exceptions. And what do I mean by that? First of all, you will get a lot of concurrency exceptions. So that would mean having actually several instances of or the same instance of the DbContext trying actually to perform several DbContext operations at the same time, and that would also not be possible. Then what you also might have is some very weird issues, and I have struggled with that really a lot until I totally understand how this works. And the issues were, for instance, that I was trying to update an entity in a certain component, and I was getting errors, for instance, that, hey, you can't do that because the entity is already tracked. But where? Because it couldn't be tracked somewhere else. But the way that the Blazor Server application is set up, you might have a lot of nested components, and you would have a very big parent component. And if you get some data there and you don't use the DbContext the right way, then, well, everything will blow, because the data that you get there will be tracked, even in a small component where you just want to perform an update. So this would be two very important scenarios. So first of all, the concurrency exceptions, and then exceptions regarding the entity already being tracked, and that can be a total nightmare. Now, the solution that I have already provided actually in that video that I have already mentioned, that is actually to use IDbContextFactory, and that actually works very, very well, and it's fine. But in this kind of setup where we have both regular request pipeline and an ASP.NET Core Server application, you might run into some type of issues. And before we actually go to that in depth, I would actually like to go here to this blackboard and just have a little bit of theory about what actually scoped in Blazor Server or in ASP.NET Core regularly means. And here we have actually this kind of like small table, like what does scope even mean? And we have here two scenarios. So the first scenario is for the regular request pipeline that you might have when you use controllers or when you use Razor pages. This means that you might have whenever you have this scenario with request and response. So what does actually that mean in that case? Well, for instance, let's maybe use dashes here. So first of all, it means that when it comes actually to a scoped service, you get one instance per request. Okay, so this is the very, very first thing that you might get here. Then what does this mean? It means that actually you can use your EntityFramework DbContext regularly, so with no problems with that. So in that case, I would say here that we can use, for instance, the DbContext, the regular DbContext. Now, when it comes to Blazor Server, the main difference here is that you don't get one instance per request, but you get one instance per circuit. And that is really important, because when is the circuit created? Well, the circuit is created when the app.razor component gets bootstrapped. And this means that in that instance, actually you get a scope for all the scope services that you need, but that scope will actually live as long as that circuit stays alive. So to give an example on that is that, for instance, if you start your application right now and you don't do a refresh, you just navigate throughout the application with all the buttons and controls that you have in the application, but you don't do a refresh or are not redirected to a location on the server, it means that if you stay 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours there, you would have only one instance of your scope services that will be reused whenever you need them in each component. Well, this will trigger the scenario where if you use the regular DbContext, then you might get in a lot of issues. So this is why when it comes to Blazor Server or to the services that are used in regular Blazor Server, not in the regular request pipeline, then we might want to use DbContextFactory. And I guess that this is actually a very, very short note. And it's theoretically, I know, but that if you get this theory about what actually scoped means in regular request pipeline and in Blazor Server, then 100% you will find everything else very, very easy. Because that's actually, I would say, the foundation of understanding how Blazor Server works and what's actually different in this hosting and programming model than in the regular ASP.NET Core application. So just to recap in this case, what we should do when we have this kind of scenario where we have also Blazor Server or we have authentication in a Blazor Server application, and of course we achieve authentication through Razor pages or controllers which are part of the request pipeline, the regular request pipeline, and we might use also scope services that at the end, of course, we think about the DbContext here, we might also use that in regular components. And in that case, we have scoped, meaning actually one instance per circuit, and that can cause you headaches. And in this case, whenever you are using services or components that are used only in your Blazor app, then you should use the DbContextFactory. So I guess that would be enough for the theory right now. So let's move actually to our code and see how we implement that, because also when we implement this concept, we might have some things that we would need to pay a little bit of attention. And what I have done already, I have prepared here this data context. with a DB set of weather forecasts so that we can read actually the forecast from a database. And I have already also populated the database with a bunch of weather forecasts. And what we actually want to do here, we have this weather forecast service, which is kind of like the default service that we have in the Blazor Server app template. And we want to replace that actually with returning information from the database. And that is a service, so pay attention to that. But this service right now, this weather forecast service, this service will be used in our Blazor Server app because we want to actually work, or this service actually works with weather forecasts, which is something that we want to render in our components. That's what our application right now is all about, handling weather forecasts. So that is where we would need them. Now let's try, instead of returning this type of random values, let's get rid of everything here and let's try to really implement this using our SQL database and EntityFramework Core. So as said, once again, we have to make this distinction. Here we are in a service, and this service will be used in Razor components or in Blazor Server, where scoped means that we get one instance per the entire lifetime of the circuit. So it means that in our case, we will want to actually use the DbContextFactory. So what we will have here is a private read-only, and it would be IDbContextFactory of data context, because that is our DbContext. And let's call this CTX factory, okay? Of course, we need to add some usings here. And then what we'll do here, we'll have the constructor, of course, regular stuff, and we'll also get this type of IDbContextFactory, and we'll call this CTS factory in this case, and we'll just assign it to the field. Okay, and that should be it. Now, how will we actually do that is very, very easy. So it means that in your services, or if you use the DbContext directly in your component, you might do that directly in the component in the specific place where you actually want to perform the database action. So what we'll do here is, let's say first var context. And what we need to do is first, let's also put a using before of that. So using var context equals, and in this case we will use the context factory and we will create an instance of the DbContext. And now that we have an instance of the DbContext, we might actually do the stuff that we want to do. So we might just return await context.forecasts to array async. That's actually what we need because we want to return an array. And of course, we don't really need a date time here. That's not important anymore. Of course, we will have to also go to some components and actually remove that. But for now, I guess we should be good to go with that. So I guess that's the main point. First of all, you inject the IDbContextFactory, and then whenever you need that, you create an instance of your DbContext. And by doing this, it would actually mean also wrapping that in a using that this instance will get disposed right when you don't need it anymore. And that means that if another component needs to work with the database afterwards, it will get a totally dedicated instance that will do that. And this is how we actually make sure that we keep our DbContext as short-lived as possible. That's a keyword here when we are working with DbContext in Blazor Server applications. So that is for how we actually set up our service, injecting the IDbContextFactory. Now, I would like to go to a next step here, which is also very, very important, because right now we already have added this at DbContext, because this, what it does, it adds a regular DbContext to our application. And why did we do this already? Well, because we have added identity, and identity registers a bunch of services that actually need our data context, and therefore we had to register it with this regular way of doing things like at DbContext, and which is fine, because right now all the services here in identity that will need the data context, they will actually be only injected in Razor pages in our applications, or in your applications might be only injected in controllers. So in that case, this is once again the regular request pipeline, and it means that we get one instance per request. So here we are good to actually use that approach. So the only thing is here we also need to add the DbContextFactory. So we can go here and say here builder.services.add where is DbContextFactory, and that's also a generic method, and we'll have to specify which actually our DbContext is. And the way we actually do this is very similar, like for the options, options.use SQL Server, and we provide a connection string. So that's exactly how we will do that. And in our service that we have just created, when we inject an IDbContextFactory, it will actually get an instance of what gets registered here in this line. And in the Razor pages where we will inject our identity services like user manager, they will use a regular data context that was registered here on this line. However, here there is already one small problem, not a problem, but exceptions in which or that you might encounter and that cause a lot of headaches for me personally, is that right now in this setup, if you'd run this application, you will get an exception right when the application starts. Let me even run that. And just show you what you could get in this type of scenario. Okay, there were build errors, but not because of our problem. Let me fix them very, very quick. So first of all, we have used this get forecasts in the fetch data, and here we actually don't have to provide a date time now. So that was one of the problems. Now this is fixed. And then also in our index.razor, it's exactly the same thing. So we don't use this anymore because we have actually changed the method in our weather forecast service. So this is why we were getting that error. Now that that's actually gone, let me go back here and let's try to run this application again, and we'll get then the error that I will actually be able to also showcase to you. So right now the application starts, and here we already got the error. You see, hey, we say some services are not able to be constructed. Okay. That's strange. What services are not able to be constructed? And it says that here Microsoft EntityFramework Core IDbContextFactory, which is of lifetime singleton, which, well, could be because the context factory is added as a singleton. And it says here that Microsoft EntityFramework Core DbContextFactory data context cannot consume scoped service. And then there is the scoped service DbContext options. Now, as I said, this error, this exception caused me a lot of headaches. But in the end, if you read that carefully, and if you actually understand how EntityFramework Core does register its services when you use DbContext or DbContextFactory, well, in that case, it might become very, very clear. And let me also clarify this for you. So what happens is that when you try to first add this service, like the regular DbContext, you provide here an action that's actually a type of DbContext builder. So these are the options that you specify. In our case, we just specify which connection string we want to use. Now, the thing is that what EntityFramework Core does is that when it tries to register your DbContext, it also it tries to it tries to register it as a scoped service because that's by default. But not only this, it also creates an instance of DbContext options and also registers that DbContext options as a scoped service, which is okay. But then the problem arises because we arrive here at line 17. And here we say, okay, now please also add me a DbContextFactory. And this is, or by default, that is added as a singleton service because it's a factory. And whenever we need, it just provides us with a new instance of the DbContext. So it's that easy. So it can be singleton, of course. Now, the only problem is that we say also we want to use the options and use SQL Server. And in this specific point, EntityFramework Core will say, okay, but I already have these DbContext options registered as a service. So Let me try to use that. Now, as remember here on this line, as this was added as a scope service, the DbContext options were also added as a scope service. And suddenly we try to actually use a scoped service or an instance of a scoped service in a singleton service. And that doesn't really work. And we have a dedicated video on service lifetimes in ASP.NET Core that might shed a lot more light about this topic, but that's actually the main problem that we have. So to solve this, we need actually a way to either have two different instances of DbContext options, or try to actually maybe build a singleton DbContext options before we actually build the scoped one. Because EntityFramework will then try to actually reuse the already existing instance, even if it is a singleton, and it tries to inject that in a scoped, and that should work. So theoretically, the workaround or the fix for this problem is actually very, very easy. Or the very easy fix is to just do this actually registration in this specific order. So first you add the DbContextFactory, because this will trigger these DbContext options to be added as a singleton service. And then when it will be reused in this add DbContext, you can resolve that. So that would work. So that is really the very easy way to fix that. So this means actually that we should have right now everything good to go. So let me go back to the index component, and I just want to change something here, because we are right now using this weather forecast array, and that might actually be null if we have to wait a little bit longer for this task to complete to actually get data from the database. And to easily fix that, let me just change this to be a list of weather forecast instead of an array, and we'll initialize that to a new list of weather forecast. That should be something similar to that, of course without 0 here and with a semicolon. And then of course here what we could do is simply delete that and use the add method on the list to just add, for instance, I don't know, let's add the second forecast in the array to our list that should be displayed. Okay, cool with that right now. So we don't have any errors, so we should be able to actually get our application going and make sure that we can actually see the forecast that we get from the database using the IDbContextFactory, of course, on our homepage. And the application started here. Let me bring it to the other screen real quick. And indeed, you see that we actually have this forecast. So everything worked perfectly. So right now we see that in the service that we actually need or use in our Blazor server part of the application, we use the IDbContextFactory. Now let me just close that a little bit and maybe just take a brief look also at the other side of the story. And the other side of the story in our case occurs, for instance, in our Razor Pages part, where we have all the authentication part and logout and register and things similar to that. And let's just take a look here at this login component, login Razor page. Now here we have on this on post. So when we just submit the form to the server, we do some stuff here, like simply signing in the user and then redirecting that to the home page. However, what I wanted to show you is that right now you see that we have injected here this sign in manager of identity user. Now here we haven't really injected directly the DbContext, but the DbContext is actually already injected in this sign in manager. And that happens so as this is actually part of the regular request pipeline where we have a scope for each request. What this will mean is that in that service, we will actually get an instance of this one, which is the regular DbContext, while in our service that we use in our Blazor server part of the application, we get the IDbContextFactory. And that would even mean that if, for instance, you might need to also perform some database actions yourself here in this login model, then you could simply say here, okay, private read only, and say, okay, I just want to inject the data context. And yeah, that would actually, let's call this context directly, something like that, of course. And yeah, we might need the using for that because that's here in the data. And we might actually want to also have this in the constructor. So let's have here like data context. Once again, ctx, we call it that way, and let's just assign that ctx equals, okay, not like that, but instead like that. Cool. So as you see, this is how we regularly use the DbContext in services or directly in controllers or in Razor Pages application. Once again, in the setup where we have a request pipeline, where we get a scope for each request. And in that case, we know that whenever the request finishes, then that instance of the DbContext is actually disposed. And of course, if you need to perform some logic here, you can, in this login or in this on post async, you can then just do all the things that you want to do with your DbContext. And once again, if we go to a very, very short summary, once again, is that when you have a Blazor Server application with services that some of them are used actually in your Blazor Server application to work with components, and some of them are used in Razor Pages or in controllers where you usually handle authentication. In that case, the best way to proceed, or at least in my experience till now, the best way to proceed and to avoid a lot of errors that you might have from EntityFramework Core, is to actually use both the DbContext and the DbContextFactory in the same application. And when you do that, the first important thing is make sure that you first register the DbContextFactory and then register the regular DbContext with DbContext. And once you have done that, you should just be careful to actually be able to distinguish between the services that will be used in your Blazor server components. Like for instance, we have this weather forecast service. And in this weather forecast service, in that case, we inject IDbContextFactory. And whenever we need to perform something on a database, we use that factory to actually create an instance of the DbContext, putting that, of course, in a using so that it gets disposed right at the end. And then we can do the stuff that we actually need to do with the database, and then everything will be disposed. On the other hand, if we have services or, well, in the part of the application that uses the regular request pipeline, like in our case, the regular page model here, we can use here the normal dependency injection like in all ASP.NET Core applications. So in that case, we don't inject the DbContextFactory, but we inject the DbContext directly, and we can reuse that because this is scoped to that specific request that is handled when the request comes into this on post async method. And if you try to really keep track, and it's really not hard when you get the hang on that, it's really not hard to do that, and make sure that whenever you need to inject the DbContext or services that need a DbContext in kind of like a part of your application that uses the regular request pipeline, you should inject the DbContext directly or the service directly, and it will use the scoped registered DbContext, like the default one, the traditional one, let's call it that way. And if you have services or repositories, whatever, that will be used in your Blazor server application, now in those you inject the IDbContextFactory. And not only that, whenever or in each method where you need to perform something with the database or on the database, you create a new instance of the DbContext, put it in a using, and then do the stuff that you want to do and make sure that that one gets disposed right when it's not needed anymore. And that will actually help you to avoid a lot of headaches and exceptions that might be thrown by EntityFramework Core if you don't really use this type of setup. Now, this being said, I guess that was actually the scope of our video, and hopefully I was able to bring you some valuable information. Once again, this time I really created this video based on a lot of headaches that I have struggled with around 1 year ago until I fully understood all these ways that this type of setup works, where we have both the regular request pipeline but also our Blazor server application, and we still need to use EntityFramework Core in both of them. If you think that this content is useful, don't be shy and feel free to share that with your colleagues, with your peers, with your friends. in your media or wherever you think that there might be an audience that would find this type of content useful, and I would be totally thankful for that. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, but also the notification bell to be notified whenever something new pops up here on the Code Wrinkles channel, because we try to bring you a lot of new content on a very, very fast pace. This being said, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.